Kia ora koutou, ko Francis Schmechel, toku ingoa. I work at Environment Canterbury in the regional biodiversity team along with my colleague Jason Butt. Do you want to stand up for a moment so people can see you? Any technical questions, go to Jason about Willows. And I also want to acknowledge my colleague Greg Stanley here, who's been doing a marvelous job of the technical side of the recordings and this computer stuff. It almost did me in 1 year trying to do that side of it. So thank you, Greg. Appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work he's doing. So this presentation is a bit of and I've got some Grant Davey slides as well. This is a bit the Grant Davey session, I think, as well. So all very intertwined, which is appropriate for Braided Rivers. So about Willows. How many of you, if any, have seen or had a chance to read the New Zealand Geographic article that came out this month about willows? Oh, you are an onto it bunch. Yep, so that's great. They are the second most abundant exotic tree in New Zealand. Any guesses the first most abundant exotic tree? Yep. And it's kind of quite a feat when you think about it, because willows are mainly confined to fresh water. And there is a lot of potential current and future habitat for them, potential habitat, all these freshwater systems, and they're also colonizing landslips. And like conifers, they are both loved and hated, beneficial and detrimental, and they cause problems. They're good at spreading, becoming wild. There's two main subgenera. So you've got the genus Salix and then all the different species, but you can kind of clump the species together into these subgenera. The tree willows and the shrub willows. And they only hybridize within that subgenera, but they do like to hybridize. The X means it is a hybrid. So for example, this is really going to test my memory without my notes. Crack willow is a hybrid between alba, Salix alba, which is the white willow, and Salix something with an X, something, but it's the eastern crack willow. I failed that memory challenge. This shows too that they are dioecious, so that means two houses. So basically, a house, being a willow plant or tree, will only have normally either male or female catkins on it, but not both on the same plant. The orange there is the male catkins from a purple willow, and the green there, the inset, that's showing a female catkin from a gray willow. Yeah, the cineraria. I've been trying to learn these scientific names because there are a lot of common confusing names for willows. They are landscape engineers, as we know. They have great value at the moment for flood management, and they are often appreciated for their aesthetics, shading streams, helping control macrophytes from plugging streams. Beekeepers highly value them in the spring, often for the pollen, and they do have some values for native habitat through like providing bat roosts, peka roosts, and the puteki nesting. But of course, with uncontrolled spread, which wildings do, they do have a lot of impacts in a lot of different areas, including causing flooding as well as helping with flood management. Also suck a lot of water out of rivers, and they can reduce the access and safety of rivers, and they have other impacts as well. There's many ways they impact biodiversity. In this example, you've got a healthy Bomia sedge there on the right, and a dead one just purely through shading out of willows on the left. So on braided rivers, as most of you are probably well aware, they cause this by constricting the river, causing you to have fewer braiding, less dynamic natural character which crowds out the native plants or habitat for the native birds, as Grant nicely illustrated, that basically they need these open shingles. And with the Project River Recovery, you saw almost all those photos on those nice open shingles and those low mat plants, which none of that can really survive under the willows. There's been a bit of an explosion recently of purple willows that's been being noted and reported. They've been planted for over a century, and when they do plant, they plant what are, it's all clones, and in theory, sterile clones. It was historically planted for basket making. They're one of the common names for them is, yes, this is where the common names get confusing, but they are a type of basket willow. But basket willow is also the common name for another willow, Viminalis. And erosion control was the other reason they were planted. But for reasons no one can fully explain, these clone sterile varieties are spreading by seed and quite explosively. Something in theory they shouldn't be doing. It's happened in the Conway. That was one of the first times it came to my attention anyway. Some of our other ECAN staff were noticing this. And the other thing that's been noted is that they seem to be fairly tolerant of flooding and flood flows. There were issues with infrastructure because of this explosion of the willows there. And so there was survey and control work that's been undertaken. Quite a bit of money spent to date, over about 4 financial years and more, has been committed for future work. This is an example of some of the spread in the Waiaufa. This in the Ashley, Rakahuri. This is an example from Grant. He's mapped the purple willow. There's also a bit of crack and some other species in there, but the bulk of those polygons in purple are the purple willow. This is in the airfield area. And this is a bit of a hot spot for, and Grant, you'll pipe up and tell me if I get any of this wrong, but total of 4 seeding willows in the river, of which 3 are here. So this is a bit of a hot spot, and he's seen thousands of seedlings under at least one of these trees, and some of them are getting quite big, up to 3 meters. Flooding in May knocked out some, but only about 40%. There was still 60% remaining of the seedlings in this area post-flooding, so it didn't really solve that problem. It was an annual mean flood, so a typical winter flood. This is another area up around the toppings area. And here it's mostly poplars, so there's no pure willow stand mapped there. It's all mixes of poplar or pure poplar stands. After a flood, it did much better. There was only about 6% of the seedlings left, mostly through being buried by gravels. So it was more effective here, but this is a narrower bed of river. So this is one of the quandaries, I think, is as we allow rivers to be wider, they don't have the same flood flows, they don't get the same clearing out, whereas these narrower sections do. Here's a sampling of some of the seedlings on the Ashley Rakahuri. And there's this other phenomenon, these zombie seedlings. So Grant was telling me about how he went out and what looked like dead plants, dead young seedlings, when he went back later, they were coming back to life. So, yeah, it's a worry what's happening with these willows. It has been for a while, but it seems to have ramped up a bit, at least in some areas. Those are the main species of concern. So it's been mainly the shrubby willows that have been the biggest problem, although crack willow is also an issue. And in response to that, we have drafted up an internal discussion document to try to get a better handle on the issue, and also what are some things that can be done. Tane's Tree Trust was onto this some time ago, and I recommend this publication. It's about 8 pages long. That if you look it up, it's called What Is It with Willows? And it was a 2012 publication, but they basically noted that there is this pattern with wilding, a lot of pest species, where you get the arrival, a long lag period, and then suddenly a bit of an expansion. And the authors warned that this could be even worse than wilding, conifers potentially. I guess time will tell. So it's a tricky problem. It's a wicked problem. As mentioned, there are an awful lot of naturalized species, at least 57 in New Zealand. And some of the clones are more invasive than others. They have, as I mentioned, confusing common names, and some species can be a bit hard to tell apart. On the plus side, there's a really good interactive key, and you don't have to be a botanical expert to use it. And there's a friendly expert here at Lincoln. There's only 2 species currently listed as unwanted organisms. That's a national designation, and that's the gray and the crack willows. And they're hybrids. But there are other fast-spreading and invasive species, like we've talked about, that are being propagated, sold, and recommended. And last night I went to look, and indeed you can buy purple willow and Viminalis, which is osier basket willow, for $24 for a bundle, and get a couple other species thrown in as well. Uses, to control them, use of herbicides over water is tricky, and biocontrol is pretty unlikely to be an option. I talked to somebody about that, and who works in that field, and they said, it's just not likely to be feasible because of the value of willows in other situations. The NES, the National Environmental Standard for Freshwater, it creates pathways, much easier pathways for controlling willows that are declared pests than those that are not. So having only 2 as declared pests does make that more difficult. This is a picture of a 3-year-old male gray willow that was just near our offices, and it was there for quite some time before it was recognized as a species. So there's this element of them being cryptic as well, and people not recognizing them as a pest or a weed, even if they might know that they are, or often don't even know. So as mentioned, of course, one of the big, roles of regional councils is to try to prevent flooding and destruction of our infrastructure and our cities and things. And willows are really valuable in that sense. But as a very prominent expert, local expert, has pointed out, we probably have to stop assuming that single-sex clones are safe to propagate, because they do seem quite good at spreading. And he gives several instances of that, 2 of which are quoted here, where that's been the case. They're adaptable. They are a bit woke, are our willows. At least 18 species have been recorded showing sexual fluidity. And so sometimes you'll have a female flower that'll pop up with male trees and vice versa. This is a bit more common in hybrids. Gray willow is probably a fairly well-known issue. It's been on the top of DOC's environmental weeds list for quite some time. They concede fairly early, after just 3 years, but I guess one of the plus sides is, compared to some other weeds, at least you can see them at years 2 and 3 and control them in theory before they seed. And there are some high country areas still pretty free of willow, so those areas are in theory also more defendable, which is why often we tend to focus some of our efforts there, just from a strategic and resource considerations. This just shows how we really don't have a great handle on the extent of willows in the region. The blue there is what is estimated to be the extent of purple willow in North Canterbury, and those red dots are what's in iNaturalist. So we need collectively probably to get more sightings into iNaturalist and get a better picture. Potential actions underway. So where they are used for flood control, looking at alternatives, engaging with the New Zealand Willow and Poplar Trust, district councils, the New Zealand Transport Authority, Waka Kotahi, and others, and raising awareness of the issue, which is partly what we're doing right now, hopefully. The New Zealand Willow and Poplar Trust is coming down here sometime in the next 3 months to actually look at. They now have genetic coding for all their clones, and so they'll be able to look at the clones that are exploding and try to figure out if it's any of the one, like if they match up. I haven't done a very good job of explaining that because that was in my notes that I can't see, but yes, we are working closely with them. So some of the work that Greg's been very involved with has been looking at these scour bays, which is areas where the berms have blown out due to flooding, and looking at alternatives for putting natives in. Now, there was some really good stats on this. There was 250,000 plants that have been installed up until 2023 in 60 places, I think, I can't remember how many rivers, lots of rivers. Anyway, it's pretty impressive, and you can look it up. And also looking at berm transition of are there places where these berms can have more natives, and so be not only a resource for flood management, but for biodiversity, and also maybe deal with some of this wilding problem. And just a couple pictures of what that's looking like in a couple places. There's other potential actions as well. We could do more around categorizing willows by their invasiveness and the habitats they're invading. We could model both the area and speed of the invasion. And we could ensure that the most problematic willows have suitable regulatory status. in this region anyway, there are places where control by any number of different parties is happening where maybe next door it's not. And it might be because NZTA planted it for erosion control, it's got away. So for biodiversity, it might be being controlled, but not at the spot where NZTA is planted. So there's a lot of cross-agency or party work and cooperation that has to occur, just like for wilding conifers. A willow survey would be helpful if the funding and resource could be found for that. And a regional or national strategy would probably be quite good too, because it's a big problem, so a strategic approach would be beneficial. And also, if it's possible to contain or eliminate seeding species or taxa wherever feasible. Obviously, a stitch in time saves 9. 1 year's weeding saves 7. No, 1 year's, I've forgotten the saying. Somebody help me out. 1 year's weeding, 7 years seeding. Thank you. Across the ditch, Australia's been all over this for quite some time. All but 3 species of willow over there are designated as weeds of national significance. They're considered some of the worst weeds in Australia for invasiveness, potential for spread, and economic and environmental impacts, and also the impacts they have on the freshwater areas there. This is just an example of a sign that they have over there, and the warning about the problems with willows. And they have a national plan. So they developed that in 2000. So I guess it's a bit of a question there whether we need something similar to what's happening with wilding conifers for wilding willows. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.
I have a question. What's happening? I mean, we looked at Australia, but is there any incidences or sort of research happening with these clones, these multi-sex, diverse, if we can use that term, happening overseas in other areas? In other words, is this a southern thing just for Aotearoa New Zealand, or is it something that seems to be happening elsewhere?
I'm going to have to throw that question out. Does anybody know if there's overseas research on this sort of thing?
About the 18 or 19 species.
Just speak about that, just because we reported.
The information about the 18 or 19 species that were throwing out non-conforming flowers, so a male plant throwing out female flowers, did come from international peer-reviewed papers. So there is a little bit of information out there, but willows are native to a lot of the world. So it tends to be places like us where they're not native, where there's an interest in their invasive nature. That's a great question.
Yep, there we go.
Cast 1,000.
Yeah.
You saw mention of 2 different contexts. The first one was called scar bays, and so that's a completely open riverbed environment that would typically where a willow species would be used, because it's so arid and difficult. You needed to be able to reliably revegetate that, and then 40 years later we've got willowland. What we're using, the reasons we referenced geotextile technology is because we are needing to use additional technologies in order to give that added survivability or added growth benefit in those initial years, so that the roots can get down out of that arid zone at the top that is just going to get tested every summer. They're going really well. It's just the usual robust, typical sort of East Coast pioneering stuff that you'd expect. I'm trying to choose things that can be found in all of the different types of habitat that you might expect to see. So things like miki, harakiki, toi toi, manatū, etc. Because, you know, they'll be on the back of a wetland, or they'll be on the edge of a river, or they'll persist into forest for a wee while, things like that. They're growing really well. We're getting really good growth rates. And then the berm transition thing is essentially trying to displace areas of established berm over time by growing underneath it and accepting that sort of litter and forest cover that you have from the exotic arrangement. Does that answer the question? I gave you 4. Yeah. Oh. Sure. Yeah, that's right. And so the most important work to try and answer that question. There's actually a research article being done by the Willow and Poplar Trust now, looking at the function of the native vegetation being used in riparian planting in floodable areas around New Zealand. And there's been a lot of focus on our work here and some work that we've been helping in the Greater Wellington, Lower Hutt area, where they've started to use a mixture of species in their flood protection efforts, but the focus being on trying to measure and comment on the function in order to have a comparable tool to Willow. So in industry questions of native vegetation, which is super important. So the answer is yes. Functions being compared. Look, man, we're like 2.5 years in, so we've got a bit more to do.
So the question was about willow seeding in New Zealand. Crack willow.
Crack willow is an interesting one. Quite recently, I think we have decided that golden willow is also crack willow, same parentage, both hybrids, both same parentage. So now golden willow is an unwanted organism as well, and that's a female clone. So we've got a male clone and a female clone, and the Salix fragilis, X fragilis, which is the standard crack willow form, is also known to produce the occasional female flower, which means seedlings as well. So yeah, they find a way around.
The question up here.
That is probably a bit of a river engineering. It depends a little bit on the species that you're observing. I don't believe we are using purple willow so much in rivers. Definitely not anymore. I'll just check, see for a nod. We're not using a lot of purple willow these days. In fact, we're not anymore. And that seems to be certainly in the Rakaia and parts of the Rakaia, certainly the upper Rakaia. That's what you're seeing, and it's purple willow. And it's possibly the same thing. I couldn't tell you, but it could be the same thing.